I just want to move away from events here in the UK to some breaking news that we're getting from Bangladesh. We are hearing that the Bangladesh Prime Minister has resigned and left the country, her destination unknown. This comes as thousands of people have stormed the Prime Minister's residence. What we're going to do is join my colleague Azadeh Mashiri, who is talking to Samira Hussain.
On the ground. Look, ever since these protests broke out about a month ago, many foreign journalists have been trying to get into the country, but no one has really been able to get any visas to allow us to give us some of that first-hand accounts, which is why we're depending on a lot of freelance journalists that are in the country. Now, one person that the BBC is working with right now has said that really he can see lots of people celebrating on the streets, hugging, exchanging garlands, a real sense of a jovial kind of atmosphere. And that would lead people to believe that, in fact, Sheikh Hasina has resigned from her position. And there are many media reporting that she has actually already left the country. If that is, in fact, the case, it is a dramatic turn of events for Bangladesh and for the Prime Minister. Remember, Sheikh Hasina only there were elections, in Bangladesh just earlier this year in January, in which Sheikh Hasina won her fourth term. But those elections, were mired in a lot of confusion there were questions about the election's legitimacy because the main opposition party did not contest in those elections, and there were crackdowns on other opposition members that were trying to campaign. And so I think there's just a lot of question about democracy and rule in Bangladesh for a very long time.
Well, to that point, Samira, I also want to confirm a BBC correspondent has now told us, one of our colleagues has told us that the Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, has resigned. Now, as a reminder for anyone who is joining us right now, we've been covering the protests in Bangladesh. The Prime Minister has now resigned and, according to reports, has fled the country. That's as protesters have stormed her residence. Now, as a reminder, student leaders have declared a campaign of civil disobedience, as they put it, to demand that Sheikh Hasina step aside. That seems to have been successful. And it's been at times violent. On Sunday, at least 90 people were killed and hundreds more injured in clashes between police and tens of thousands of anti-government protesters. And the death toll does include at least 13 police officers. Samira, could you just put this into context for us, given the hold that Sheikh Hasina has had on the country in the past? How big a moment this would be for the country?
Look, Sheikh Hasina's government, not just this particular term, but her last few terms, have been mired in controversy. Lots of members of the international community critical of her increasingly authoritarian regime. Now, remember, these particular protests started about a month ago, and originally it was student-led, and they were demanding an end to these quotas that exist for civil government jobs. And that was, in fact, overturned by the country's Supreme Court. But since then, we've seen that the protests have really swelled, and it became much more of a movement to try and remove Sheikh Hasina from power. It became very much an anti-government movement. Now, the ruling government, of course, has called the protesters terrorists and said that they're just operating on behalf of the opposition parties in the country. But the fact that we're seeing that Sheikh Hasina has actually resigned, has left her position, and is now going to another country, a safer country, in all likelihood, she's probably going to come here to India. I mean, this is a really dramatic move for Bangladesh. And now, of course, it begs the question of what's going to happen in terms of government. What is the leadership structure going to look like? And is this going to end up leaving some kind of power vacuum vacuum. Now it's going to be really interesting to see just what happens on the ground.
And Samira, just for context for our audiences, we're showing live pictures from one of the broadcasters that's showing some of the protests that have been taking place. It's from Channel 24. And we're seeing people celebrating, we're seeing people march. A few moments ago before, we were watching people storm the residence of Sheikh Hasina, as we mentioned earlier, the palace that she is said to have fled. Samira, could you remind us of the police response that had taken place? How does something like this succeed and happen? What happened to the military, for example? Because there were questions, weren't there, about whether the military would intervene against students?
Right, and there was no sense that the military was going to intervene, which perhaps could lead to questions about the loyalties of the military and whether that has in fact shifted. I mean, look, it's not just the student-led protests that are going to bring government down solely, at least perhaps in this situation, but it is probably going to be a confluence of events. You know, there is going to be questions about how much support that Sheikh Hasina had within her own government, and perhaps she was losing confidence there. The police crackdown on these student protests was really quite harsh, very severe. We saw that, some 300 people have died over the last month or so. And that is worse than, that's the violence that they haven't seen since the country has fought its war of independence back in 1971. So this is a very significant moment in Bangladesh's politics and in the country.
And Samira, I don't know if you can see these pictures, but we're still showing them from the broadcaster, the local broadcaster there, and we're seeing people with chairs, sofas. It seems that these are coming out of that residence. Again, Sheikh Hasina is said to have fled with her sister to a safer place. We still are not sure of the location, but it looks like people are grabbing anything they can find and destroying the premises as they declare this sort of victory. I do want to again pause and reflect on what a big moment this would be, given Sheikh Hasina has essentially been in charge since 2009. In her late 70s, and now it would seem she's been toppled by this student-led movement. Samira, could you put into context what sort of victory this is for the students? Because they've questioned democracy, whether democracy truly exists in Bangladesh. How have elections taken place in the past?
Well, as far as the elections have taken place, I was on the ground for the most recent elections in Bangladesh, and, you didn't have opposition parties that were contesting in the elections. You saw on the ground only, flyers and posters and billboards for those that are contesting as part of the government. So there really wasn't much of an election atmosphere. And in fact, we were able to speak with people that did work for the opposition parties, and they would operate in secret. There was a lot of people that were scared for their own safety. We spoke with one opposition party official, who said that he doesn't even spend his nights at home because that's usually when government officials come knocking. So there was this real pervasive sense of fear for anyone that didn't toe the government line. And if you're seeing the kind of reaction that we're seeing with people storming into the prime minister's home and looting the prime minister's palace, you can imagine this is a group of people that have felt that they were very much put down and were under authoritarian rule, and it's this sort of moment for them to break free. And doing this it can sometimes be a cathartic sort of it is a cathartic sort of reaction to the rule that they have endured since, as you rightly pointed out, 2009.
And Samira, I also just want to pause here on how events have moved so quickly in some ways, especially in the last few hours that you and I have been speaking, because this morning we were talking about the march starting. We were expecting an army chief to give an address at about 8 o'clock GMT. And we were talking about curfews and internet blackouts. It just seems like like none of that was able to prevent someone who's seen as a somewhat authoritarian leader staying in post. So what was that sort of security infrastructure that has collapsed? Have we seen a sort of weakness like this before?
Well, I think we started getting some early signs of a change or a shift when we heard that the speech was being delayed, or the address to the nation by the army chief was being delayed, because there were still some internal negotiations that were happening. There are also some unconfirmed reports that, Sheikh Hasina wanted to deliver a taped address to the nation, but apparently that was not possible. There was a lot more of a push to try and get her out of the country, because if you saw on the streets that thousands and thousands of students were mobilizing to make a march towards Dhaka, towards the city center, and presumably to the palace. So there was certainly a security issue for the prime minister and her family. But then we saw that, although there were lots of police barricades around the city of Dhaka, we saw that the police were actually allowing the students to come in. So those were early indications that you saw actually there was a monumental shift that was happening within the government.